Hi guys, how are you? It's me again in Miss Cole's room this time, not the library. Oh, you're kind of tilted there. Let me see if I can't straighten you up. There we go. I am here to read you chapter 12 of on the Imposters. We'll see what's happening to Luke. He made himself wait an entire week before he went back to the woods. But in that time, no matter how closely you paid attention to everything, the mysteries only seemed to multiply. By the end of the first week, Luke was even more baffled by the lack of windows than ever before, because he discovered there wasn't a single window in the entire place. To learn that, Luke had to make himself figure out the floor plan of the entire school. He had to be sure that he peeked into every classroom, every sleeping room, every office. One morning at breakfast, he even pretended to get turned around and plowed straight into the kitchen. Two cooks screamed and Luke was given a stern lecture and a record 10 demerits, but he found out what he wanted to know. Even the kitchen lacked windows. Why? Why would anyone build a windowless school? Luke wondered if there had been something unusual about his family house, that it had windows and he just accepted it as the norm. But no, all the houses and schools and other buildings that Luke had seen in books had windows. And when the government built Jen's neighborhood, all the houses there had windows, and Jen's family and their neighbors were barons. If barren houses had windows, why didn't barren schools have them? Luke couldn't figure out the other boys either. There were rocking boys in some of his classes, in most of his classes, he realized now. Several times, Luke practically hypnotized himself staring at them, but they seemed harmless enough. The boys who worried Luke were the ones he called the starers, the ones who looked back when he looked at them. All the hall monitors were starers. So was Jackal Boy. Luke tried to tell himself that the starers bothered him only because he'd spent so much time in hiding. Of course he didn't like being stared at. They were probably just acting normal, and he was in danger of giving away his real identity by getting disturbed by it. But somehow he couldn't believe that. At night, when Jackal Boy tormented him, Luke kept his eyes trained carefully on the ground, but he could feel Jackal Boy's gaze on the side of his face as definitely as he could feel a slap or punch. "Say I am an ex-nay of the worst order," Jackal Boy ordered him as usual one evening. Luke mumbled the words. He wondered what would happen if he looked up and unleashed his questions on Jackal Boy. Why do you stare? Why aren't there any windows? Why do we never go outside? Why was the door open that one day? And finally, are there any other shadow children here? But of course he couldn't ask Jackal Boy. Jackal Boy thought it was funny to make Luke wave his arms for 5 minutes straight. Jackal Boy was only interested in humiliating Luke. He probably thought it was amusing to tell the population police, "I know where you can find a third child. How big is my reward?" So Luke bit his tongue and gritted his teeth and touched his finger to his nose 50 times as ordered. He jogged in place until his legs ached. He reached for his toes again and again until Jackal Boy said in a bored voice, "Get out of my sight." Luke crawled into bed, unsure whether to be relieved that he hadn't blown his cover or disappointed that he hadn't found the answers to his questions. That night in bed, he was too busy puzzling over all the mysteries to even think about whispering his own name. When he had his pretend conversations, he asked advice instead of offering apologies. "What do you think, Jen? What's wrong with this place? Is there something wrong? You went out on the world on fake passes all the time. Do people everywhere act like the boys at Hendrix? Ask, and Mother and Dad, what's your opinion? Is it okay if I go back into the woods again?" But it was ridiculous to feel like he had to give permission from parents he'd never even see again, or to ask from a friend who was dead. It was just too bad that that was all he had. Luke swallowed a lump in his throat. He couldn't solve the school's mysteries, but he was going back to the woods no matter what. And that's actually the end of chapter 12, but I bet you want to hear 13, so 12 was short, so I'm going to read 13. Chapter 13. Luke worked out a plan for leaving the school every day after lunch and coming back right before dinner. It was sort of a compromise. He thought he ought to go to some classes, no matter how little sense they made to him. And this way, he wouldn't miss any meals. He was already hungry all the time. He already had trouble keeping his fancy baron pants hitched up on his scrawny frame. The first day he left, he slipped out while the hall monitor was looking the other way. He knew now that none of the other boys would even notice. So easy, Luke thought to himself as he jogged across the lawn to the woods. Why don't all the boys escape out here? He decided it wasn't worth troubling himself with unanswerable questions. The sun was shining, and he could tell that even the leaves that had been curled up and tiny a week earlier were full grown and spread out now. High overhead, the arc of tree limbs in some part of the woods blocked out the sky completely. It's like a cave, Luke thought. but that reminded him of hiding and cowering indoors. He moved out into a clearing where grass struggled to grow through last fall's dead leaves. It looked like there was a raspberry plant too, mostly buried in tangled brush. Raspberries, Luke whispered, his mouth watering. Mother grew raspberries back home, and every June she kept the family stuffed with the raspberry pies and cakes and breads. She made raspberry jam too, and spread it on their toast and spooned it into the cornmeal mush all year long. Luke eagerly searched the branches in front of him. Tasting a raspberry would be like visiting home just for a minute, but there weren't any berries yet, only an occasional bud. And it was likely the weeds would choke out those buds before they matured, unless Luke cleared the brush around them. It only took 10 or 15 minutes to pull the weeds and give the raspberry plants room, but by the time he was done, he had a full-blown idea in his head. He could grow a whole garden out here. Surely no one would mind, or even find out. In his imagination, he saw neat rows of sweet corn, tomato plants, and peas. He could put strawberries and blueberries over at the side of the clearing where they get some shade. He'd want beans too. Squash wasn't practical because it wasn't much good raw, but there was always cucumber and zucchini, cantaloupe, and watermelon. Luke's stomach growled. And then he remembered seeds. He didn't have any. Luke's dream instantly withered. How stupid was he that he thought he could grow a garden without seeds? Luke could imagine how Matthew and Mark would make fun of him if they knew. Even Dad and Mother would have a hard time not laughing. Just a month away from home, he'd already forgotten what you needed for a garden. Luke stared at the measly raspberry plants in disappointment, and then he could almost hear Mother's voice in his ears. Make the best of what you've got. How many times had he heard her say that? Even one raspberry would be delicious. And maybe he could find blueberry or strawberry plants somewhere in the woods and transplant them. And maybe he could get seeds from some of the food at school. The bean sprouts they were feeding him, for example, could he plant those? He didn't know what kind of beans they'd grow into, but even if they were soybeans, Jen had told him once that the government thought those were edible. Roasted, maybe. He could build a fire. And maybe later in the summer they would serve tomatoes or cantaloupes or watermelon, and he could smuggle the seeds into his room somehow. It would be too late for planting by then, but he could save the seeds for next year. It made Luke's throat ache to think of staying at Hendrick's school a whole year. A whole year without his family. A whole year of grieving for Jen. A whole year of not speaking to anyone but Jackal Boy. A whole year of having nothing but a fake name and clothes that didn't fit. Luke stood up and planted his feet firmly in the ground. I have the woods, he said aloud. I have the garden. This is mine. That's the end of chapter 13, and I'll try to get 14 to you soon. I hope you are staying safe at home. I hope that you are doing some schoolwork. If you're not, you better get on it. We have hotspots at school if you need them. All you need to do is call and let us know, and we'll call you when they're ready. If you don't have access to internet, if you do have access to internet, please check your emails. Hope to see you soon, guys. I miss you a lot. Bye.